contract was signed by candlelight at 1 minute before midnight, and the man who sold her did not look at her once while he did it. Seraphina Wren stood at the cold edge of the great hall of Ravensmoor, with her hands folded and her chin level, the way she had taught herself to stand in rooms where she was being discussed and not addressed, and she watched the quill move across the paper that made her a wife. She was 23 years old, the dowerless ward of a man who lent money to lords and collected on it without mercy, and she had been raised on the plain understanding that a girl with no name and no fortune was a thing other people spent. So she was not surprised, exactly. She had known since girlhood that she would one day be the price of something. She had only not known it would be tonight, and that the buyer would be a duke. Her guardian's name was Silas Craig, and he was a heavy, soft-handed man who smiled while he ruined people, and the debt he had come to Ravensmoor to settle was not his own. It belonged to the dead. The late Duke, Adrian Caldwell's father, had borrowed against the estate in his last bad years and died owing Craig a sum that could have bought a county, and Craig had come north through the autumn rain to collect it from the sun in the only coin a proud Broke House had left. Not money, a marriage. There was a clause, old and cruel and binding, that let a creditor name a bride into a debtor family in settlement of an unpayable note, and Craig had a ward he wished to be rid of, and a duke who would rather take a stranger to wife than see Ravensmoor sold out from under his tenants. So it was done, by the candle. At midnight, two people who had met an hour before were bound for life, and neither of them had been asked whether they wished it. She had ridden north for 9 days in a closed carriage to reach this hall, and across every one of those days she had told herself a hard, sensible thing, which was that she had survived worse, and would survive this. She had been a ward of Craig's house since she was a girl, which is to say she had been its unpaid servant with a better name for it, and she had learned early that the way to live through being owned was to keep one small room inside herself that no one held the key to. She kept her thoughts there, she kept her pride there, and in the worst of it, on the worst nights she went there and was, for an hour, no one's. It was the only inheritance she had, that small locked room, and she had carried it the whole 9 days north toward a marriage she had not chosen, the way she had carried it everywhere because it was the one thing the men who spent her had never once managed to take. She had one other thing of her own in all the world, and she touched it now without meaning to, a small worn locket of dark blue enamel on a thin tarnished chain, no bigger than a robin's egg, with a crest half worn away on its face that might once have been a swan with its wings spread. She had worn it since before she could remember. It had been around her neck, the old women of Craig's house said, when she was found as an infant on the steps of a foundling hospital in a basket lined with silk too fine for any pauper, in a winter when half the great houses of the kingdom were burning. She had asked, as a child, whose it was. No one had ever been able to tell her. She had stopped asking, but she touched it in the hard moments the way another woman might touch a cross, and signing away her life to a man whose face she could barely see across a cold hall was the hardest moment she had yet been handed. And so her fingers found the locket and held it and were steady. The Duke of Ravensmoor was nothing she had braced for. She had built him on the ride north out of the only material she had, which was every cruel man she had ever served. She had built a brute who wanted a wife the way a man wants a brood mare for the heir that was in her. The man across the hall was nothing of the kind. He was tall and dark and very still, 34 perhaps, with near black hair swept back and a hard, handsome face and eyes the color of a coming storm. And he did not look at her the way the brute of her imagining would have. He did not look at her figure or her dress or the price of her. He looked at her face, once, fully, the way a man looks at another person he has just done a wrong to and means to account for it. And when the quill was set down and Craig rose smiling to make his oily bow, the Duke did not bow back. He said in a low, cold voice that did not rise, "You have your settlement. The note is discharged. Be gone from my house by first light, and if I learn you have spoken her name in any room of the capital, debtor's clause or no, I will find a way to ruin you that the law has not yet got a word for." Craig's smile slipped just once. Then he gathered his papers and went, and the great doors of Ravensmoor boomed shut behind the man who had sold her, and Seraphina Wren was alone in a cold hall with her husband of 4 minutes. He did not come toward her. That was the first thing she would remember after, that a lesser man would have crossed the floor and taken his property, and this one stayed where he was, a careful room's width away, as though he understood that the space between them was the only mercy he had to give her tonight, and he meant to give it whole. "Madam," he said, and stopped, and she saw the trouble in him, the way a proud man troubles when he has been made complicit in a thing he despises. "I want you to hear this from me before you sleep one night under my roof. I did not want a bought wife. I do not hold with men who trade women across a table like a parcel of land, and tonight I have been made one of them, and I am ashamed of it." He drew a breath. "You are not a prisoner here. You are not a servant. The marriage is law and cannot be undone, but what it is to be between us is not yet written, and it will not be written by force. You have my name and the protection of my house, and you will have a door that locks from your side, and nothing will be asked of you that you do not freely give. I am sorry it was midnight. I am sorry it was a candle and a creditor. You deserved a better beginning than the 1-2 dead men's debts have left you." She had armored herself against cruelty. She had no armor at all against that. She had crossed half a kingdom in a cold carriage rehearsing how she would endure a brute, and the man in front of her had just handed a frightened stranger the one thing she had never in her life been given, which was a choice, and she found she could not speak around the thing it did to her throat. So she said, instead, the truest small thing she had, which was, "It is very cold in this house." And the Duke of Ravensmoor looked at her a moment, and something moved at the hard corner of his mouth that was almost, not quite, the ghost of a smile, and he said, "Yes. It has been cold a long time. I have rather stopped noticing." And he called for a woman to show her to a warm room, and he did not follow her up, and that was their wedding night, a sold bride sleeping behind a door that locked from her side, in a house that had stopped noticing it was cold, holding a worn blue locket she could not read. If you have come this far into Seraphina's story, take one moment and subscribe before you go further, because what happens at first light is the part I have been waiting to tell you, the morning that turned a bought bride into the most dangerous woman in the kingdom. She woke before dawn out of long habit in a bed too soft to trust, and for a moment did not know where she was. Then she remembered all of it at once, the candle, the contract, the cold, tall man who had said, "You are not a prisoner here." And she rose and dressed in the gray light and did the thing she had always done in a strange house, which was to go and look at it before it was awake, so that she would know its corners before anyone could use them against her. She went down through a sleeping palace of cloth-draped furniture and faded grandeur, a great house that had clearly been selling itself off room by room for years, pale squares on the walls where paintings had hung, a chandelier wrapped in sacking, a grand staircase with a worn runner that had once been crimson and was now the color of old brick. It was a proud house gone threadbare, holding its chin level over an empty stomach, and she recognized it at once because she had been doing the same thing herself her whole life, and she found that she pitied it, and was surprised too. She came at last to a long gallery hung with the portraits of the dead Caldwells, and she walked it in the thin dawn the way she walked everything, alone and watchful, her locket cool against her breastbone. And it was there, at the cold far end of the gallery of someone else's ancestors, that the morning broke her open, because the portrait at the end was not a Caldwell. It hung apart from the others, older, its gilt frame nearly black with age, and it showed a young woman in the high, stiff fashion of 30 years gone, auburn red hair, large green eyes, fair porcelain skin, a face Seraphina had seen every morning of her life in every polished surface she had ever passed, because it was, allowing for the years, her own. and around the painted throat of the woman who wore her face hung a small locket of dark blue enamel on a thin chain, with a swan on it, wings spread, clear and unworn and unmistakable. Seraphina stood before it and could not breathe. She lifted her own locket in her fingers and held it up beside the painted one, and the half-worn ghost on her enamel and the bright crest on the canvas were the same crest, the same swan, the same blue, and the world she had been standing on her whole life, the world in which she was no one, a foundling, a thing to be spent, simply gave way beneath her feet. "That is the Princess Seraphel of Aldor." The voice came from behind her, low and cold and very quiet, and she turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway of the gallery in his shirt-sleeves, his storm-gray eyes moving between the painted face and the living one with an expression she could not name. The last daughter of the old royal house, she was lost as an infant in the burning of the Aldor line 30 years ago, when the usurper took the throne and put the whole family to the sword, all but the youngest, a baby girl, who was carried out by a loyal nurse and never found. The crown has been searched for her for 30 years, because by the old law she is the rightful queen, and the man who sits the throne tonight knows it, and has spent 3 decades and a great deal of blood making certain she stays lost. He came forward slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. My father kept that portrait because he was loyal to the old house when loyalty was a hanging matter. I have never known what became of the child. His gaze dropped to the locket in her hand, and Seraphina watched the understanding go through him like cold water, and she watched the proud, cold Duke of Ravensmoor go very still. "Where," he said, in barely a voice at all, "did you get that locket?" She told him the truth, because she had nothing else and was too undone to lie. The foundling steps, the silk-lined basket, the winter the great houses burned, the locket that had been around her neck before memory, and that no one had ever been able to read. And the Duke of Ravensmoor, who had bought her at midnight to save his tenants and meant to give her a door that locked from her side and asked nothing of her ever, stood in his own cold gallery and understood by first light that the dowerless ward 2 dead men had traded across a table was the lost queen of the kingdom, and that he had just married her in secret in the dark, with a creditor for a witness and no soul living the wiser. "My God," he said softly, "he sold you to me to bury you." Craig knew, or his master did. A lost princess married off into a broke northern house under a false name, a bought wife no one would ever look at twice. It is the surest way in the world to make certain you are never found. They did not give you to me as a debt. They hid you with me as a grave. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the dawn came up gray and slow through the tall gallery windows and lit the painted face, and the living one with the same thin light, so that for an instant the dead princess and the lost one seemed to be the same woman looking at herself across 30 years. Then Seraphina did a thing that surprised them both. She did not weep, and she did not faint, and she did not ask the Duke what was to become of her, which is what a frightened bought bride would have done. She turned back to the portrait of the mother she had never known, the woman whose face she wore and whose name she had just been given, and she looked at her a long, quiet while. And then she said in a steady, low voice, "Then they have been afraid of me for 30 years. A baby on a step. They put a whole family to the sword, and they have spent 3 decades and a great deal of blood being afraid of one girl they could not find." She turned to the Duke, and her green eyes were not frightened at all. They were, he would say later, the first truly dangerous thing he had seen in that house in years. "I have been no one my whole life, Your Grace. It seems I was never no one. It seems I was the one thing the most powerful man in the kingdom could not sleep for fear of. I find I should like to know why." That was the first morning. There would be many mornings after, and across them the cold house slowly stopped being cold. They did not become man and wife all at once, because he had meant what he said in the hall and did not unsay it now that he knew her worth had a crown on it. If anything, he grew more careful, because a man who would not take a bought stranger by force was not about to take a queen by it. So instead they did a stranger and a finer thing across that long northern autumn. They became, first, allies, and then friends, and then, so slowly that neither of them could have named the day it changed, something neither of them had braced for, and both of them had stopped believing they would be given. He taught her what he knew of the old house, the genealogies, the loyal families that still remembered, the careful map of who at court might be a friend and who would sell her to the usurper for a ribbon. She taught him, without ever meaning to, what it looked like when a person who had been spent her whole life slowly understood she was worth something, and he found he could not look away from it, the way you cannot look away from a fire being lit in a house you had thought abandoned. There was a night in October she would always keep apart from the rest. A storm had come down off the moor, and the old house groaned under it, and a great elm by the east wing came down in the wind across the stable roof, and every soul in Ravensmoor went out into the rain to get the horses clear before the beam gave. Seraphina went too, not as a duchess, who would have stayed dry by the fire, but as a woman who had spent her life being useful because uselessness was not a thing a ward could afford. And she stood to her boot tops in the cold mud, holding a terrified carriage horse by its halter and talking it steady while the Duke and his men levered a fallen beam off the last stall. And at some point in that long, wet hour, he looked across the lantern light and saw the lost queen of the kingdom up to her elbows in the wreck of his stable, soaked through, her auburn hair plastered to her face, murmuring to a frightened animal in a low, steady voice that was getting it through the worst of its fear. And he stopped, just for a breath, in the middle of the rain, and something in the careful wall he had built around himself for 30 years quietly gave way, the same as the elm had given all at once and along a line that had been weakening a long time. He said nothing. He was not a man who said such things. But when the horses were clear and the house went in dripping and laughing in the giddy way people laugh after a near thing in the dark, he took off his own sodden coat and put it around her shoulders without a word, and she let him, and neither of them spoke of it, and both of them knew the marriage had changed in the rain. It was after that night that he began, in pieces, to tell her why the house was cold. He did not do it all at once, and he did not do it as confession. He did it the way careful men give away the truth, a little at a time and always sideways, mentioned and then left, so that she had to gather it across many evenings by a low fire and assemble it herself. His father had been a good man and a weak one, who had loved a doomed cause and a dangerous bottle in roughly equal measure, and had spent the family into ruin, keeping faith with a murdered king while letting his own son grow up in the cold of a house that was always quietly dying. His mother had hardened around the shame of it, and Adrian had learned young the thing that all such children learn, that it is safer to want nothing, because a house that is always being sold cannot be relied upon to keep even the things you love, and a boy who needs nothing cannot be made to grieve. "I made myself very good at it," he said one night, not looking at her, turning a glass slowly in his hand. "At needing nothing. I thought it was strength. I have lately begun to suspect it was only a long fear wearing strength's coat." He did not say the rest, which was that she had been the one to make him suspect it. He did not have to. Seraphina, who had built her own small locked room out of the same cold for the same reason, understood him better than anyone living, and she did not try to fix him, and she did not pity him, and she did him the one kindness no one had ever done either of them, which was to let him be exactly as wounded as he was and stay anyway. And the Duke, who had armored himself against need as a boy and worn the armor a lifetime, felt it begin to come loose in the warm fire-lit evenings beside a woman he had bought to save his tenants, and was, for the first time, more frightened of keeping the armor than of losing it. She was not, it turned out, the frightened thing the world had made of her. Set free of the men who had spent her, Seraphina Wren, Seraphel of Aldor, turned out to have a mind like a blade, and a courage that frightened even him. She read the histories of her murdered house dry-eyed and asked hard questions. She learned the names of the dead. When the Duke, trying to protect her, suggested they keep the secret buried forever, that she live out her life safe and quiet as a forgotten northern duchess and let the lost princess stay lost, she refused him to his face. "You said this house was loyal to the old line when loyalty was a hanging matter," she said. "Your father kept that portrait at the cost of his neck. There are families across this kingdom who have remembered my house in secret for 30 years, who have buried sons for it, who light a candle on the old queen's name day and say nothing. I will not let their loyalty go to a coward who hid in the north because it was safe. I did not survive being no one in order to spend the rest of my life being no one in better clothes." And the Duke of Ravensmoor, who had thought himself the strong one in the marriage, looked at the woman he had bought to save his tenants, and understood that he had got, by accident, in the dark, by a creditor's cruelty, the bravest soul he had ever met, and that he had begun, against every wall he had built, to love her past all sense. Not everyone under his roof was so easily won. The Duke's mother still lived, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, a proud, cold old woman of 60 with silver-gray hair in a severe, high coiffure, and her son's own storm-gray eyes set in a lined, handsome face, who had spent 40 years guarding the dignity of a house she had watched go threadbare around her, and who had not been consulted about a midnight marriage to a creditor's nameless ward any more than the bride had. She received the news of who that ward truly was, with the flat disbelief of a woman who had been disappointed too many times to spend hope cheaply. "A foundling with a trinket," she said. "The kingdom is full of them. Every coney catcher and confidence girl from here to the capital has a sad face and a stolen locket and a tale about a great house she was stolen from. You have married a stray, Adrian, and now she will dress the stray in a dead princess's story and call it a crown." She would not look at the locket. She would not stand before the portrait. She treated the lost queen of the kingdom as a clever beggar who had got above herself, and she did it in the cold, gracious way of a great lady, which was crueler than shouting, and Seraphina, who knew that particular cruelty in her bones, having served it her whole life, did not flinch from it and did not fight it. She simply was every day exactly what she was, and let the old woman watch. What broke the dowager's wall in the end was not an argument. It was a portrait and a name day, because the dead Princess Seraphel of Alderay had been, before the burning, a girl at the same court as the young Margaret, and they had been something like friends, two high-born girls in the same dancing lessons before the world went to fire. And the dowager had never spoken of it in 30 years because grief that old goes silent, not soft. And one gray afternoon, Seraphina, not knowing any of this, came on the old woman standing alone before the portrait at the cold end of the gallery where she never went, with her proud lined face wet and bare in a way no one had been let see in 40 years. And Seraphina did not speak, and did not retreat, and did not make of it anything the old woman would have to be ashamed of having been seen in. She came and stood beside her, quietly, and looked at the painted face they both in their different ways had loved, and after a long while she said only, "You knew her." And the Dowager Duchess Margaret, who had guarded the dignity of her house for 40 years and called the lost queen a stray to her face, said in a cracked old voice, "I knew her. She had that exact way of holding her chin level when she was afraid. You do it too. I have been watching you do it for a month and telling myself it was a beggar's trick, because the alternative was that she was alive after all, alive and in my son's cold house, and I could not—" And she stopped and could not finish, and Seraphina took the old proud hand in hers and held it, and that was the last wall in Ravensmoor to come down, and it came down, the way the deepest ones always do, not to force but to a kindness offered at the right unguarded hour. What she did with that found freedom was not to hide in it. While the Duke mapped the court for her from memory, naming the great houses and their loyalties the way another man might name the stars, Seraphina did the patient, unglamorous work that wins quiet wars. She learned the names of every loyal family the dead king had ever had, And then she learned which of their sons had died, and how, and which of their daughters had married into the usurper's circle and might be turned, and which of their old retainers were still alive and still angry and still poor enough that a forgotten loyalty might be worth waking. She kept it all in a clasped book in her own careful hand, the way Craig had kept his ledgers of debt, except that her ledger was of loyalty, which she had learned in his cold house was the rarer and more valuable currency. The Duke watched her do it and understood that he had married not merely a queen by blood, but a queen by temperament, that the same hard intelligence that had kept her alive and unbroken through a life of being spent was exactly the intelligence a recovered throne would need, and that the usurper, who had spent 30 years fearing a helpless infant, had been right to be afraid, only for the wrong reason. "You frighten me a little," he told her once, watching her seal a letter by candlelight. She did not look up. "Good," she said. "I have spent my whole life being the one who was afraid. I find I prefer this side of it." The world, of course, did not approve. The usurper's reach was long, and Craig had a master, and the master was a cold, polished creature at the very center of the court, a noblewoman named Lady Cassandra Fairmont, ice-blonde and beautiful and bloodless, who had spent her life as the throne's most useful instrument and who had been the one, 30 years a girl herself, to first whisper that the lost Aldor child might still be alive and ought to be made certain of. It was Cassandra who had found the foundling's trail. It was Cassandra who had arranged, through Craig, to have the dangerous girl married quietly into oblivion in the north. And it was Cassandra who learned that autumn through a servant's loose tongue and a guardian uncle's greed that the burial had not taken, that the lost princess had not been smothered in a broke house's silence, but had instead found, in the cold Duke, she was meant to vanish beside, an ally, a name, and a husband who would die before he let her be made certain of. So, Cassandra Fairmont came north herself, smiling, with a fur-trimmed cloak and a writ, and a troop of the usurper's quiet men, to finish 30 years of work. She came in winter when the roads were bad and Ravensmoor was cut off, and she came smiling, the way the worst of them always come. She sat in the Duke's own hall and drank his wine and told them pleasantly how it would be. The girl was no princess, she said, merely a dowerless ward with a stolen trinket and a convenient face, an impostor, and she, Lady Cassandra, had a writ from the crown to take the impostor south for examination, which everyone in that cold hall understood was a polite word for a quiet death on a bad road. The Duke could keep his estate and his name and his tenants and his pride. He need only hand over the bought wife he had been gulled by and forget she had ever crossed his threshold. "You bought a parcel of someone else's trouble in the dark, Your Grace," Cassandra said sweetly, "and I have come to take it off your hands. Let us neither of us pretend you are losing anything you chose." And here is the thing the cold, beautiful woman at the center of the court had failed, in 30 years of certainty, to learn about people. She did not understand what it was that made a man like Adrian Caldwell stop being careful. She had built her whole life on the idea that everyone could be reasoned with, frightened, or bought, because everyone wanted to keep what they had. She had never met a man who had found, late and by accident, the one thing he was not willing to keep anything else in order to lose. The Duke of Ravensmoor set down his glass and rose, and when he spoke his voice did not rise either. It went lower, the way the cold goes deepest in the stillest part of the night. "You have made one mistake, my lady, and you have built 30 years on it. You believe I bought a wife? I did not buy a wife. I married a queen, and I will burn this house and everyone in it to the ground before I hand her to you, and you may carry that south to your master and tell him the North remembers the old line, and the North is done being afraid." It was not won by a duke's defiance alone, though. It was won, in the end, by the woman they had both spent their lives underestimating, because Seraphina had not spent that autumn only learning the names of the dead. She had been writing, to the loyal families, the ones who lit the candle on the old queen's name day, the ones who had buried sons for a memory. She had sent her locket's twin, copied in careful ink, and the testimony of the old women of Craig's house who remembered the foundling and the silk-lined basket, and the sworn word of the Duke whose father had kept the portrait at the cost of his neck, and the word added late and freely of the Dowager Duchess Margaret, who had known the dead princess as a girl and would swear before God and the kingdom that the living one wore her face and her chin and her name. And on the worst night of that winter, when Cassandra Fairmont's quiet men moved to take the impostor from her bed by force, they found the long lane to Ravensmoor full of torches, not the usurper's men, but the old loyal families come north through the snow, lords and farmers and the grown sons of murdered houses, who had carried a memory for 30 years and had just been handed, at last, a face to put it to. They did not come to fight, they came to witness. And there is no quiet death possible for a lost princess once 500 loyal souls have stood in the snow and seen her face and known the swan on her locket for what it was. Cassandra Fairmont, who had spent 30 years making certain the girl stayed lost, stood at a frosted window and watched the one thing she could not reason with or frighten or buy fill up the night with light, and understood that her work was undone, and that she had undone it herself by coming to finish it. She did not stay to be humiliated. The cold, polished creature at the center of the court simply gathered her fur and her writ and her quiet men in the gray of the next morning and went south, smaller than she came, to carry word to a usurper who would now have to reckon, after 30 years, with a rightful queen the whole North had seen and would not unsee. The guardian, Silas Craig, who had sold the girl meaning to bury her, learned that the parcel he had traded across a table had a swan on it and a kingdom behind it, and was gone from the kingdom entirely within the month, having grasped that there is no debtor's clause in the world that protects the man who sold a queen into a grave. And the usurper on his stolen throne, who had spent 3 decades and a great deal of blood keeping one infant lost, woke to find her found, not dead on a bad road, not smothered in a broke house's silence, but standing in the loyal North with a duke at her side and 500 witnesses at her back, and the whole careful machinery of 30 years' murder simply stopped being able to turn. It was not a quick thing after the setting right of 30 years. That is a story for the histories, and the histories, for once, would get this one nearly right. But the turn of it, the place where the whole long wrong began to come undone, was a cold gallery in a broke northern house at first light, where a sold bride held a worn blue locket up beside a painted one, and a careful, proud man understood what he had married in the dark. They were wed again that spring in the open, in the light, with no creditor for a witness, but instead the loyal families who had stood in the snow, and the old women who remembered the basket, and the Dowager Duchess Margaret standing dry-eyed and proud at last in her dead friend's daughter's honor, and the deaf kind widow named Mistress Halloway, who had once given a foundling girl honest work, and asked no questions and stood by her when it cost something to do it. Seraphina wore crimson and gold, and her hair half pinned with loose tendrils, the way her murdered mother wore it in the portrait, and around her throat she wore the locket, the real one, the worn one, the swan half gone to time, not the bright copies she had sent across the kingdom, but the original, the one that had been around her neck on a foundling step in a winter when the great houses burned. She would not trade it for a crown. She said so to the Duke, on the night before, when the jewelers had laid out the regalia of a recovered house and asked which she would wear. She lifted the small, worn blue thing in her fingers and said she had carried it through every cold room of a life in which she was no one, and it had been the only thing in the world that was hers. And it had turned out to be the proof of everything, and she would be buried in it before she would be crowned in anything else. And the Duke of Ravensmoor, who had stopped noticing his house was cold, and now noticed every warm thing in it because she was the one who had lit them, took the worn blue locket from her fingers and fastened it himself around her throat with a care that 30 years of court jewelers could not have matched, and said the thing he had been too proud and too careful to say since a morning in a gallery had undone him, that he had bought a wife to save his tenants and been handed a queen by the cruelty of 2 dead men's debts, and that he would not undo 1 minute of it, not the candle, not the creditor, not the cold. That the worst beginning a person was ever handed had carried him to the only thing in his life he had ever been unwilling to lose, and that he had stopped, somewhere in the snow with 500 torches in the lane, being afraid of how much. She kept the locket on through the long good years that followed, through the setting right and the histories and the slow careful work of being, against every odd, a queen who remembered being no one. The small locked room she had carried inside herself her whole life, the one no one had ever held the key to, she found at last she did not need, because she was no longer owned by anyone. And a person who is free does not have to keep a hidden self in reserve against the day she has spent. She opened the room and let the light in, and it stood empty and unguarded. And that, more than any crown, was the thing 30 years of fear had been keeping from her. And in the evenings of her old age, when the grandchildren asked her how she and their grandfather had met, she would touch the worn blue swan at her throat and tell them the truth, which sounded like a tale and was not, that she had been sold to him by candlelight at 1 minute before midnight, the price of a dead man's debt, a girl with no name and a worn locket no one could read, and that by morning he had walked into a cold gallery and found out she was the lost queen of the kingdom. And neither of them in 50 years ever once wished it had happened any gentler than it did. She would tell it with a particular smile, the people who knew her said, not the smile of a woman who had been rescued, the smile of one who had, in the end, rescued herself, and let herself be loved while she did it, and found there was no contradiction in the two. A crown, she told the grandchildren once, is not a thing you put on. It is a thing you finally stop being afraid to set down. And she set hers down gently on the table by the window where the last light was going gold, and she kept the locket, and the swan, half worn away, caught the dusk and held it.